Hello, lovers of history. It is time for another edition of Virtual Story Time. So, stories like I would read in class, but virtually, so you can listen when I'm not there or when you're not there either. And it'd be really awesome if my daughter gets me a glass of water because I forgot to get one before I read all this. So, today's focus of story time is going to be the Whiskey Rebellion. And hopefully, you already have some background in the Whiskey Rebellion. What we're going to do today is a special twist. We're going to hear three different stories, all in the Whiskey Rebellion. So it's from three different historians from three different time periods. And I want you to pay attention to the words that are used are different, words that they describe different people, whether it's Native Americans, whether it's the protesters, whether it's the people making the laws. Who do they shift blame to? Um, how do they just describe the different events of the time? You'll definitely notice a difference. And I will say that my daughter is awesome, that she did bring me a glass of water. And maybe because she heard it's about the Whiskey Rebellion, she brought it in a shot glass. That's the water I have for these three stories. Ah, humorous. All right, so I'm going to first tell you a little bit about the three historians. So let me change this to view mode. That would be so much better. Here we go. So the first historian we're going to read from is Claude G. Bowers. And he wrote a book that we're going to read from 1925. He was a real prankster, too. As you see here, he was a newspaper editor and a columnist. He also was a Jeffersonian. And that's important when you read who does he sort of put the blame on for the Whiskey Rebellion. So he really helped develop the positive reputation of Jefferson that lasted for a long time. You can argue to this day. He also used that to help shape the image of the Democratic Party when he was active of it to be the party of anti-monopoly and for the people, so to speak. He was in fact an ambassador to Spain under FDR during the Spanish Civil War and actually had to return and was later an ambassador to Chile. Most people won't tell you, can't tell you who he is. Even many historians might not know. But at his time, he was a best-selling author. Like three of his books were bestsellers. Next, we're going to actually next we will listen to a small clip from Willard Sterne Randall. He is a historian, a professor, but in history primarily a biographer. So he wrote biographies on Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, Ethan Allen. And you'll see that he was born in Philadelphia, so it's probably not a coincidence then as to why his focus of history is really in the colonial period and the revolution. And last, we're going to hear from a contemporary author, Alexis Coe, best-selling author right now. Her book has topped the New York Times list. You see her on a lot of commentating on TV. She has podcasts. She's like the it historian of the moment, and we'll read from her best-selling book on Washington. All right, so let us start with this book from Bowers, and this is from 1925. On my book, I lost my bookmark. Um, from 1925, and the book is Jefferson and Hamilton. So, who do you think he was going to write about favorably here? All right, so think about this. This is 1925. But right away, you'll see just even what they call the protesters is different than we usually hear today. The Whiskey Boys of the Insurrection of 1794 have been pictured as a vicious, anarchist, unpatriotic, despicable lot. And they were nothing of the sort. These men were doing more for America than the speculators of Boston and New York, for they were hard-working conquerors of the wilderness, felling the forests, draining the swamps, redeeming the land for the cultivation of man. Fortunately for America, they were a tough set. These rough men in coarse raiment and coonskin, with muskets on their shoulders, were not arrayed for a pose. They fought their way against savage forces, subduing nature while warding off the blows of the tomahawk. Their lot was hard. No luxuries in the log cabins where they fought, wrought, suffered in the Homeric work of extending an empire and making it safe for the soft creatures of the counting rooms and drawing rooms who would ultimately follow. Newspapers they seldom saw, books scarcely at all, and most were illiterate. It was a long cry from these powerful figures with muscular arms and dauntless hearts to the perfumed dandies simpering silly compliments into the ears of the ladies at Mrs. Bingham's. Within a radius of 100 miles, there were but 70,000 souls. Pittsburgh was a crude little village of 12,000 people. Here they lived, shut off from the eastern country by the mountains, for the passes and winding roads through the dense woods were too rough for vehicles. The little trade they carried on with the east was through the use of pack horses. From the south they were shut off by the savage tribes of red men. Here they were, left to shift for themselves by their government, which manifested little interest in their welfare, but did not forget the taxes. Because there was no market for their grain, they were forced to convert it into alcohol. Let's train the dog somewhere else. Which was largely their medium of barter. Money was seldom seen, and their excise tax laid on their alcohol was payable only in money. No people in America received so little benefit from the government, and none were hit so hard by the excise law. Perhaps these pioneers who thought themselves abused were ignorant, but there was an intellectual giant among them who knew they were abused. This was Albert Gallatin. A mingling of comedy and pathos in the story of the insurrection. The masses were victims of a few demagogues, but alas, these demagogues were working with the real grievance. Public meetings had not served to moderate the passions. Wise advisers like Gallatin were unable to control, and the extremists followed the more flamboyant and less scrupulous. The law was resisted, officials intimidated, prisoners released from custody by mobs, and farmers who informed revenue men of the location of stills read their mistake by the light of the burning barns. When Washington sought to suppress the insurrection through negotiations, it was too late, and the troops he summoned marched. It was inevitable that politics should play a part. The excise law was Hamilton's child, born to meet the obligations of the Assumption. The Jeffersonians had opposed its passage, and Jefferson thought it an infernal law. Then, too, it was felt that Hamilton welcomed the opportunity to test the federal power. There had been too much skepticism on the point, and he longed for a decisive contest with the mob. Bach had complained that Hamilton's report to Washington on conditions in the trouble zone read like a lawyer's summing up to the jury. The Federalist Papers traced the trouble to the Jeffersonians because they had opposed the enactment of the excise law, denounced the democratic societies for inciting the people to insurrection, and satisfied those more unminded that a demand for a law's repeal is the same as urging its violation. These were the days when the high-flying Federalists, under the shadow of Washington on horseback, were meditating the sedition law. Yes, and the alien law as well, for they were pointing to the foreigners as the ringleaders in the plot to overthrow the government. The Irish, now numerous in Pennsylvania, were mostly Jeffersonians. That was enough. Fenno warned of the refuse of Europe that will swarm to our shores if the laws are not rigidly enforced. Wolcott wrote his father that the insurrection was a specimen of what we are to expect from European immigrants, and that Pennsylvania need not be envied her Irishmen. Down with the Democrats! Down with the critics of public men and measures! Down with the foreign devils! On these themes the Federalists harped through the summer and autumn. Their persistence was so persuasive that Muhlenberg, the speaker, narrowly escaped defeat for renomination because he had vetoed against the excise law. The Hamiltonians made the most of the situation. And he goes on to explain like the party's stance of the two of them. So let's now jump ahead from 1925 to 1997. I read this book first in 2006, according to my notes here. And just a small part. Randolph's conciliatory argument swayed Washington. In August, he sent a federal commissioner west to offer amnesty in return for order and to gather intelligence. By mid-September, they sent word of a strong armed minority in western Pennsylvania that was refusing amnesty. Washington now decided to call out 12,000 men from the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia, and Maryland militias. As he issued a proclamation to justify the use of troops to put down the so-called Whiskey Rebellion, he squeezed into his old uniform and traveled west toward the place of rendezvous with Hamilton at his side. Secretary of War Knox was on home leave. He was in Maine. It was to prove Washington's last outing as a soldier. As he rode west, he learned the welcome news that his old cut and thrust field commander, Mad Anthony Wayne, had won a major victory over the Western Indians at Fallen Timbers, Ohio. Suffused with martial spirit, the 63-year-old white-haired Washington rode toward Bedford, Pennsylvania, where nearly 40 years ago he had shaped for action during the Forbes expedition. The militia rallied around the old commander, singing, "To arms once more, our hero cries. Sedition lives and order dies. To peace and race then bid adieu, and dash to the mountains, Jersey blue." After gathering his troops at Bedford on October 28th, Washington returned to Philadelphia and left Henry Lee at the head of his army. All resistance collapsed. 20 would-be rebels were shipped back to Philadelphia and, after a trial that produced little evidence, all but 2 were released. One was a simpleton, the other insane. Washington pardoned both. The episode was not only provided an outlet for a virulent war frenzy, but left Washington unshaken in the belief that the self-created democratic Republican societies have been laboring to sow the seeds of distrust, jealousy, and, of course, discontent, and still could trigger home resolution in the government. And I'll leave that there to see that. So obviously, Washington, the Jeffersonians, all that is portrayed differently at this time. And once again, you'll hear one more story. This is the more modern. Oh, I didn't put the picture on when I read Randall's pip. Oh, that's disappointing. I'm not going to read it again, though. So, I'll just pretend his picture was up. But notice I mentioned into his old uniform. She suggests something slightly different. Pay attention and maybe you'll pick up on it. So here we go, Alexis Co. Right after Washington refused to use military force against a foreign nation, he turned it on his own people in what would ultimately be the biggest overreaction of his life. In 1794, the government was having trouble collecting an excise tax, a part of Hamilton's plan to pay back foreign debt, from distillers in the Kentucky and western Pennsylvania backcountry. Whiskey was their main export and sole profitable activity past basic farming, they wrote in a petition to Congress. Higher prices would make their product less attractive to consumers, and the expectation that they, rural folk, should repay a disproportionate share of foreign debt was unfair and untenable. When the petition didn't work, the peaceful gatherings began. The largest numbered around 6,000 and took place on Braddock's Field in Pittsburgh, where, almost 4 decades before, a young Washington had picked up the sash of his fallen commander and emerged a hero. The distillers' complaints went unheard. Their frustrations mounted. The tax collectors closed in. Then, finally, violence erupted. Hamilton informed Washington that a crowd in Pennsylvania had seized an unlucky collector named Robert Johnson, tarred and feathered him, cut off his hair, deprived him of his horse, obliged him to travel on foot a considerable distance in the mortifying and painful situation. Another man, he said, no more than a messenger, was seized, whipped, tarred, and feathered, and after having his money and horse taken from him, was blindfolded and tied in the woods, in which condition he remained for 5 hours. And around 400 rebels set fire to the Pittsburgh home of John Neville, the collector's supervisor. Washington seems to have taken this personally. He was no king. He had not handed down the tax to fund his jewel habit or build a 7th castle. Rather, democratically elected officials had voted it into law. He saw these local attacks as a direct challenge to legitimate federal authority and was determined to squash the protest and have its participants tried for treason. But according to the Constitution, the commander-in-chief could send in troops only at the request of state officials, and Pennsylvania Governor Thomas Mifflin wasn't ready to take that step. Washington saw a rebellion, but Mifflin saw isolated and largely whiskey-fueled acts of desperation from a community that felt unheard. Only land-owning white men could vote, and land ownership in western Pennsylvania had fallen dramatically since the earliest period of white settlement. In some townships, none of the locals owned any land at all. Their landlords, the ones who were allowed to vote, lived in the big cities. Much of the population covered rent and other necessities by bartering crops or whiskey. They rarely paid in cash, which was scarce in the region. For the majority of the population, then, even a low yearly tax would leave them with nothing. Mifflin didn't make excuses for the rebels, but he believed the courts should decide how to resolve the impasse. Washington did not. In an extraordinary showing of executive overreach, he sidestepped both Mifflin and the Constitution, securing a judicial writ from Associate Justice James Wilson, called out state militia for federal service, and hired a tailor to make him a uniform modeled after the one he'd worn in the war. You pick up on that? Whenever the government appears in arms, it ought to appear like a Hercules, Hamilton would write in 1799, and the 12,000 soldiers he led toward what is now Pittsburgh showed he meant it. Washington, 62, was there too. He became the first and only president to take up arms against his own citizens and to come along for the ride, though he did so mostly from a carriage, dismounting only when it was time to review the troops. Knox, who had gone to Maine to see about a house he was building, was noticeably absent from the forces gathering in Pennsylvania. He had neglected, despite the situation, to communicate his personal plans in a timely fashion. When he finally offered to meet up with the president's party on the road, Washington was livid. It would have been nice to have Knox by his side, he wrote in a passive-aggressive letter on October 9, 1794, if your return in time would have allowed it. It is now too late. Excluding Adams from the business of the executive branch was one thing. Telling the Secretary of War he was unwelcome during a military campaign was quite another. But in the end, the showdown with the insurrectionists of the Whiskey Rebellion never happened. When government troops arrived at Braddock's Field, there was no one to fight. There was also no Washington. He thought better of his presence at the last minute and turned around. And what is equally astonishing, Jefferson later wrote to James Monroe, is that by the pomp of reports, proclamations, armies, etc., the mind of the legislator itself was so fascinated as never to have been asked where, when, and by whom has this insurrection been produced. The press was stunned by Washington's imprudence. The men famous for the self-control judicious had neglected to consider whether military action was warranted. Couldn't he have simply threatened the poor civilians into submission, or better yet, actually talked to them? With some effort, the troops arrested 150 whiskey rebels. Bless you. I got a sneezing dog. But without much evidence, with few people willing to testify, only two men, John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, were found guilty of treason. Although Washington bragged about the peaceful resolution, he must have felt embarrassed about the situation, or at least the reception of his overreaction had received. He used a presidential pardon for the first time in history and let the men go. But months later, Washington still had a point to make. During his sixth annual address to Congress, he blamed self-created societies for inflaming dissent against the government and causing greater divisions across the country. Federalist congressmen felt violated by the president's rare use of strong language, while Democratic Republicans felt personally attacked. They had nothing to do with the rebellion, and furthermore, free speech and public debate was protected by the Constitution. In a letter to James Monroe, the U.S. Minister to France, Madison wrote that the introduction of self-created societies by the president was perhaps the greatest error of his political life. So I'll leave it with that. I want you to reflect on the different ways these stories are portrayed, the different perspectives, who it looks at honorably, who it looks at with suspicion, and why do you think these different perspectives came about in the time periods that they did. Now it's time for my shot of water.